In this video, we're going to be looking at the DJI Air 3S and how it compares in low light. We're going to be looking at both photo and video and going through all the settings, so both auto and pro mode, to see which gives you the better results, both photo and video. So I did some thorough testing. I was literally out for probably more than 2 hours for this, using waypoints, going back and forth, running each setting to see which one looks better. And then we're even going to compare it with the DJI Air 3 here and see how much it has improved over that too. If you haven't seen the DJI Air 3 video at night, I'll put a link up here and you can always go and check out that video because that deep dives into this one specifically. If you're new here, hi, my name is Dimitrios and I create videos on drones, photography and everything in between, and it's a mixture of entertaining and educational content. Subscribe to stay up to date. Now let's take a deep dive into the Air 3S at night, and we'll be starting off with photos. Now I'm going to be looking at my notes here because I've written everything down. So let's look at photos. The first thing to note here is that 12 megapixels is better than the 50 or 48, depending obviously which focal length you use. Remember, 24mm is 50 megapixels, the 70mm is 48 megapixels. The other good thing here is that with 12 megapixels, the photos are actually faster. When you're in this high megapixel mode, the photos take a lot longer to capture. That being said, you do get a lot more detail, obviously, with the higher megapixel count. You can see that in the photos. However, when you do zoom in on them and you start pixel peeping, there is this weird artifacting on the higher megapixel photos, whereas the 12 megapixels, you don't get that at all. So it's a lot cleaner image. Now, when I was testing both, whether just using regular auto mode or switching to pro mode, auto actually does a good job. Even though it's taking control of everything and it's using like these random ISO numbers rather than fixed values, the images can come out really clean. However, when you use pro mode, you can get the cleanest image at ISO 100, but just note when you have it ISO 100, you have to have a longer shutter speed, and this just introduces light trail, so it's going to introduce a lot more motion in your image. This isn't a big problem. I actually enjoy the light trails. It's a long exposure photography at the end of the day, so it comes down to preference. The minute you start raising the ISO, obviously you're going to introduce more noise into the picture, but if you use programs like Lightroom, it does a really good job in removing that noise and making it a really clean image. So even if you opted for the 50 megapixel photo or the 48 megapixel photo, and you had a higher ISO value in order to get the correct exposure, and you have a lot of noise in your image, denoise does a wonderful job, and I have used this in the past. Personally, I actually think the 70mm looks better. I don't know if it's, again, just me. I just think the 70mm focal length looks way better than the 24. But again, it comes down to preference at the end of the day. There's no right or wrong here. I'm just really loving the 70mm, even though it's f2.8. So it doesn't have as much light as the 1-inch sensor on the 24mm. Normally when I am exposing my photos, I either use the exposure value at 0 or -3. It's always better to go down in order to help retain the highlights. You can recover the highlights better when you underexpose, even at night. That's just me, and that's always worked for me. Now, if you want to do long exposure photography, you would need to have a longer shutter speed. Now, you'd have to use an ND filter here. Now, I tested the ND8. These are the ND filters that I got with the DJI Air 3S, and they worked wonders. Now, obviously, it depends how much ambient light you have in your area where you're taking photo. So an ND8 was sufficient. If you're in like major cities, maybe like Toronto or New York or wherever, and there's a lot of ambient light, you might need an ND16 in order to use those higher shutter speed settings. Now just remember here on the 12 megapixel mode, you can go up to 8 seconds. In the 50 or 48 megapixel mode, you can go up to 2 seconds max shutter speed. Just remember that when you are doing these long exposure photos and it's taking a while for the drone to capture it because the shutter speed is open for longer, this could introduce blurry images because obviously they're not going to be perfectly still as if it's on a tripod. So if there is like a slight wind, if you zoom in onto the photos, it might introduce some blur. Now personally, when I'm taking drone photos at night, whether it's the DJI Air 3S or the Air 3 here, I will take multiple photos. So I'll shoot in auto, I'll shoot in pro mode, I'll use 12 megapixels, 50 or 48 megapixels, to get as much content as possible. And that way, when I do come into Lightroom, I can then just pick and choose which one gave me the best results. So it's always better to overshoot while you're there than having to just take one photo, come back, and suddenly the photo's not that great. Now, when comparing the DJI Air 3S to the Air 3, the noise definitely looks different. Like when you zoom in between the two images, it's almost like the Air 3S has this multicolored noise, whereas the Air 3 doesn't have that. I mean, it's a bit strange, but at the end of the day, just using denoise will help clean that all up. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Have you used the DJI Air 3S or the Air 3 at night? What results or what settings are you using? That being said, now let's move on to video, because this one's an interesting one. First up here is the DJI Air 3S, comparing the different color profiles. So for this, I was shooting in auto and letting the drone do the work. I can definitely visibly notice a difference here, especially in the highlights of the image compared to the Air 3. In normal mode, it looks very good. It's very clean and not much noise at all. In HLG, it does a good job, but it looks like it does have a greenish tinge. And for DLOG-M, I have used the conversion LUT, which is free, available on DJI's website. Now, for those of you who don't want to rely on auto and prefer to have fixed values so they don't change or fluctuate when you're trying to film, I did test this as well. First of all, I did the normal color profile. And again, we already know that auto does a really good job, but ISO in my scenario where I was at, it seemed a little bit too dark. So I went straight to ISO 1600, and here it did a really good job here. And you can see where it's in the highlights, when you compare it to the higher ISO values, so 3200, 6400 and 12800, they're just way blown out. Even though there isn't much noise in the darker parts of the image, it's the highlights that are the issue here. So if you want to shoot in the normal color profile, ideally you want to keep this as low as possible to retain the highlights within the video. You might be able to get away with ISO 800, but the problem is when you start lifting up the shadows, it could introduce that unwanted noise you have, unless you use programs like DaVinci Resolve where you can get rid of this. Now, I also did DLOG-M as well, and just note here with DLOG-M is that the ISO values don't go as high as they do in normal mode. So again, auto does a really good job, so if you want to just stick on concentrate on flying, you'll be fine using auto mode. I think DJI have done a very good job here. But if you want to take over control, now it looks like ISO 800 and 1600 is the way to go here. Again, 800 seems to retain the highlights better than they do in 1600, but it all depends on how much ambient light that you have and where you're shooting. 3200 is fine, not much noise in the darker areas, but again, when you take a look at the highlights, it is very difficult to recover these in post. So you're better to use a lower ISO. And obviously, if you increase these shadows too much, it's just a bunch of noise, so it's not really worth it and it looks like crap. Now, I did test HLG here. I didn't test the ISO values, but I did test whether using the Filmic LUT or using a color transform node in DaVinci Resolve. So which looks better, the Filmic LUT or the color transform node? To me, it seems like the color transform node seems to be better this time compared to when I was doing the video mode testing. However, the Filmic LUT seems to do a better job at retaining the highlights. I don't really shoot in HLG, it's not my thing. I think DLOG-M is the way to go. Or if you just don't want to do any post-processing, use normal mode. Now, how does the Air 3S compare to the DJI Air 3? Well, when we compare these side by side, you can see there is a noticeable difference how much better the highlights I've retained because of this bigger sensor here. So yeah, the Air 3S is the way to go for nighttime drone videography here. So overall, the Air 3S is a fantastic drone already. There is incremental updates that DJI have done to make this drone better. It does a better job at retaining the highlights in both photo and video. The tones seem to be a little bit on the warmer side as well with the Air 3S compared to the Air 3, but this isn't a big issue. Like, you can easily just change the temperature within your video editing software. And I think Billy Kyle also mentioned this as well in his video testing. Yeah, I don't think I've seen his low light one yet, but in his daytime one, the Air 3S seems to be a little bit on the warmer side. Also, when I was doing my testing with the Air 3S here, the vision assist system seems to be too sensitive, but in some scenarios when the DJI Air 3S was running its waypoints, it seemed to have picked up on the dark side that it found something in its way and it cancelled the waypoint, which I found bizarre. Also, when I was trying to take off to get the drone up in the air and to start running these waypoints, it almost like it was sensing that there was objects there and like, just move. I wanted this thing to move and it wasn't moving. So I feel like the sensitivity on the sensors are a little bit too high, especially when you're trying to take off. It got a bit annoying. Also, I just ran a hyperlapse as well. I had a battery left over because you get a long flight time. So I thought, why not run a hyperlapse, see what it looks like. So what do we think? What looks best to you? Normal, HLG, auto, pro mode? How much more of a difference is there with the Air 3S to the Air 3? If you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a like and subscribe for future videos. There's more videos coming soon with the DJI Air 3S, and YouTube recommends you watch this one next.